Alright, hello everyone. Welcome to this third video about the article Social Network Changes and Life Events Across the Lifespan, a meta-analysis. I want to start off by saying that this article has quite a lot of methodological information, and I won't actually be going that much into it. I know that the lecture talks about the important parts of that article, so definitely watch the lecture to get that information. I'm going to talk about it a little bit, but not too in depth. I thought I probably wouldn't be able to explain it as well as the lecturer does. So, in developmental science, the size of social networks and how they vary across adulthood are unclear. The definition of a social network is described as the set of people with whom an individual is directly involved. Direct involvement in this case means repeated interactions between a dyad and also the mental representation of the relationship as such. This definition distinguishes social networks from social groups. In social groups, members can, but do not have to, entertain social relationships, like in a school. There are different types of social networks, distinguished by the kinds of relationships that they include. You have the global network, which comprises of all existing social relationships of an individual. The personal network, a subnetwork made out of closer relationships, also sometimes described as support networks. The friendship network, the family network, and the work-related network. The size of a social network is an important characteristic because it also indicates social resources. The number of relationships in the subnetworks is also important because certain relationships fulfill certain functions. Reported size can vary depending on the assessment method and other methodological factors used, and this meta-analysis incorporates studies with these varying methods. There are two major theories that address changes in social networks over the life course. The social-emotional selectivity theory is one of them. This theory describes how social goals change over the entire life course due to shifts in perspective on how much time one has left to live. With this, also social relationship changes. During adolescence and young adulthood, information acquisition goals are more prevalent. People focus on gathering knowledge and information from diverse relationships and sources. This is best achieved through large networks. Throughout the rest of adult life, emotion regulation goals become more important. The network size decreases, and it is assumed that this is actively sought and not just merely experienced or happened throughout age. This theory also predicts a pattern that peripheral relationships decrease during adulthood, whereas close relationships, they persist throughout life. And the theory attributes this to the notable increase of emotion regulation goals. Then the second theory is the social convoy theory. This theory holds that people maintain a network of social relationships that escort them over the life course, like a convoy, and a convoy is a group of travelers. Tried to find a picture for it, but I could only find convoys of trucks, and when I typed in travelers, I got time travelers, so you have to do it without, unfortunately. Relationships in this convoy differ in the levels of closeness and how they depend on social circumstances. And therefore, they are affected differently by changes in a person's circumstances. The innermost circle should be highly stable as opposed to the periphery relationships. This theory predicts the same pattern as the previous one, so that peripheral relationships decrease, whereas close relationships persist. But this theory attributes that to a different cause. They attribute this pattern of decrease in stability to altering circumstances in a person's life. The peripheral relationships are therefore more vulnerable to changing circumstances. Life events can change social networks. Life events are far-reaching that take place with changes in behavior. Events can be classified as normative, biological, social, and physical events, or non-normative, which are only experienced by a few. Normative life events vary in time and can be things like school entry, puberty, marriage, parenthood, etc. Most researchers classify puberty as a life event involving major biological and social changes. Marriage is assumed to extend the spouse's network through in-laws and partners' friends. And of course, in this process, selection still occurs. The transition to parenthood often reduces social networks because you're busy with your new child and probably also your partner. And due to something called the social comparison theory, which says that parents-to-be compare themselves to friends regarding attitudes toward children, these social relationships might increase or decrease. If you agree on the way you look at children, you will probably continue the relationship. But if you disagree on it, the relationship will probably be discontinued. Job entry then again expands your global networks, and loss of a spouse, of course, reduces it. Whereas the loss of a spouse is expected at a certain age, the death of a relative is a non-normative life event. Research on the effects of this life event is still scarce. Generally, it is suggested that it has effects on all domains of personal and social functioning. Divorce is an especially stressful and non-normative life event. It reduces the person's social network. Relocation strongly affects social networks since it might be harder to maintain some of the relationships. This article tries to show that age-related changes correspond to life event-related changes. The writers have 3 research aims in which they address different factors of social networks. The size of different types of social networks and their change at a certain age, whether these changes are related to normative or non-normative life events, and they discuss 3 moderator effects: the sample, the assessment, and the time. Within these aims, there were many assumptions and hypotheses, and I highlight a couple. The first, the assumption that the family network will stay relatively stable over time. That age-related network changes are congruent with life-related changes. That there are 3 moderator effects that influence the reported social networks, and that samples from countries that are individualistic will report larger global networks than collectivistic countries, because individualism is related to being more open to a person outside the family, and that collectivism is the other way around. Now we go to the methods section, which again, I don't go into too much detail about this. For that, you really have to watch the lecture. To figure all of these questions out, they used longitudinal and cross-sectional studies, and overall it was a very, very extensive literature research using 277 studies in the end. For each study, they coded the study characteristics and effect sizes related to the size and change of a specific social network. So in other words, they attributed points to certain characteristics that a study could have. And you can see these points in the image. Then the results. First, network sizes were largely robust to sample differences. So the first moderator does not have that big of an influence. However, as expected, samples from countries with a collectivistic orientation reported smaller global and personal networks. The type of assessment used in the study made a difference for the average reported global, personal, and family network sizes. It appears that if you use an interview technique as opposed to a questionnaire, the subjects report larger networks. The year of publication was related to the average size of personal and friendship networks. With every 5-year period, the average size decreased by 1.6 people. And lastly, as assumed, family network size remains stable throughout life. which is a finding that is concurrent with the social convoy theory. Global, personal, and friendship networks expand during adolescence and shrink in later adulthood. Age-related changes are congruent to life event-related changes. This suggests that social network development follows an age-graded path, and age-related events accompany or even prompt these specific changes. Overall, the assumption that global network size increases, then plateaus, and then decreases is supported. However, the friend network is the hardest to be concrete about, since longitudinal studies report an increase, whereas cross-sectional studies report shrinkage from adolescent to old age. Changes in social networks associated with normative life events closely mirrored the age-related network changes observed in these life phases. This once again supports the idea that age-related and event-related changes are congruent. Non-normative life events did not follow a pattern of age-graded network changes because these life events are not for everybody and thus cannot be attributed to a specific age. This article also makes the assumption that network changes will be less pronounced or even absent for an individual if certain life events have not yet occurred. In other words, simply going through life and aging does not equal the same changes as when you experience normative or non-normative life events. The article also reports some limitations, and the first one is the generalizability. Children were not included in the samples. The majority of the studies came from the US, and there was a research gap for studies into middle adulthood. Peripheral relationships at work, church, and in the neighborhood, or maybe at voluntary services, might be very important and were not as much included in this meta-analysis. Also, what the writers called e-acquaintances, relationships with others over the internet, have increased in importance in the last decade, but they are not as much researched. Alright, this was the third article discussed. I hope it's helpful, and thank you for watching.